If a town demands a life to keep its secrets, then tonight it will take the wrong one. The wind tore across the jagged cliffs as Evelyn Hart stood at the edge, her wrists bound in pale silk that fluttered like a mockery of innocence, her thin slippers slipping against the cold stone as the ocean roared nearly 40 feet below, swallowing sound and mercy alike. While behind her the townspeople gathered in a trembling half-circle, their lanterns flickering like guilty hearts that refused to look directly at her face. Their whispered prayers not for her salvation, but for their own protection, as if offering her would erase what they had done long before this night ever came. And though her breath came shallow and sharp in the freezing air, Evelyn did not cry, did not beg, because somewhere beneath the fear tightening in her chest was a quiet, stubborn understanding that this was never about fate or gods or ancient promises. It was about silence, about burying something that should never have been hidden. And she lifted her chin just slightly, enough to let the wind catch the loose strands of her hair, enough to remind them she was still human, still watching them, still remembering, while the old man at the front raised his trembling hand and spoke the final words that sealed her place in their ritual, words that sounded ancient but felt hollow, rehearsed, wrong, and for a moment the entire world seemed to hold its breath, the sky heavy with storm clouds, the lantern flames bending low as if bowing to something unseen, and Evelyn closed her eyes not in surrender but in defiance, clutching the small hidden weight pressed against her palm beneath the folds of her sleeve, a locket worn smooth with time, the only thing they had not found, the only truth she still carried. And then the sound came, not from the sea, not from the wind, but from the distant echo of hooves striking stone with purpose, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the ritual like a blade through silk, and one by one the murmurs faltered, heads turning, fear shifting shape. Because something was coming that did not belong to them, something that did not bow to their quiet cruelty. And when the figure emerged through the rising mist at the path's edge, tall and unmoving against the storm, there was a stillness that spread through the crowd like frost, a recognition without welcome, and Evelyn opened her eyes just as the stranger's voice carried across the cliff, low and controlled, yet powerful enough to still the wind itself. Stop this. And in that single command, something inside her chest, buried beneath dread and resignation, stirred for the first time, not hope, not yet, but the fragile, dangerous sense that fate, once decided, had just been challenged. No one moved at first, as if the command itself had frozen the air, and then slowly, like a tide pulling back, the crowd shifted, their lanterns dipping, their voices swallowed by a silence that no prayer could fill, while the man at the front lowered his raised hand, not in obedience but in uncertainty, his authority unraveling beneath the weight of the stranger's presence. And Duke Adrian Blackthorne stepped forward into the circle of flickering light, his boots steady against the stone, his dark coat catching the wind as though it answered only to him, his gaze sweeping once across the gathered faces, not with anger, not with haste, but with a quiet, immovable certainty that made men avert their eyes and women clutch their shawls tighter, because this was not a man who asked permission. This was a man who decided outcomes, and Evelyn felt it before she understood it, the shift in power, the fracture in the night's cruel design, as his eyes found her at the edge, pale against the storm, and something unreadable passed through his expression, not pity, not curiosity, but recognition of something deeper, something wrong in a way that could not be ignored. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, sharper. Untie her. The words falling with the weight of law, and a murmur rippled through the crowd, resistance trembling beneath fear, until the old man stepped forward, his voice unsteady but stubborn, speaking of tradition, of sacrifice, of promises older than memory, yet every word sounded weaker than the wind itself, and Adrian did not raise his voice, did not argue. He simply held the man's gaze until the protest faded into silence, because power did not need to shout when it was absolute. And then, as if the world itself had decided, the knot at Evelyn's wrists loosened, the silk falling away in a whisper that sounded louder than the sea below, and for a moment she did not move, her arms still lifted as though expecting the next command, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and instinct, until Adrian crossed the final distance between them. each step measured, deliberate, closing the space that had felt like a lifetime. And when he reached her, he did not hesitate, his hand steady as it took her wrist, not gripping, not claiming, but grounding, anchoring her to something real, something solid against the chaos of the night. And the warmth of that contact, brief and controlled, sent a tremor through her that had nothing to do with fear, because no one had touched her like that before, without judgment, without ownership, only certainty. And as he guided her away from the edge, turning her from the drop that had waited for her fall, the crowd parted without being told, their silence now heavy with something new, something far more dangerous than belief, doubt. And behind them the storm continued to rage, indifferent to the shift it had witnessed, while Evelyn's fingers tightened around the hidden locket in her palm, her mind racing, because this man had just altered the course of her life with a single decision, and she did not yet know whether he had saved her or drawn her into something far more inescapable. The moment her feet left the edge, the world felt unreal, as if the wind itself had forgotten her name, and Evelyn walked beside him in silence, each step away from the cliff heavier than the last, because survival did not feel like freedom. It felt like stepping into something unknown, something that carried its own kind of danger, and she could feel the eyes of the town still fixed on her back, not with relief, not with forgiveness, but with quiet resentment, as if by living she had broken a rule no one dared speak aloud, while Adrian Blackthorne did not slow, did not look behind, his presence carving a path through the night that no one challenged. And when they reached the waiting horse at the edge of the narrow road, the lantern light revealed more of him, the sharp lines of a man accustomed to command, the calm of someone who had already weighed consequences and dismissed them. And without asking, he turned slightly toward her, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "You will come with me." Not a request, not even a question, but a conclusion already made. And Evelyn hesitated for the first time since her bindings had fallen, her fingers tightening around the hidden locket in her palm, because choice had returned to her too suddenly, too dangerously, and she did not yet trust it, not after what had been taken from her. And her gaze lifted to meet his, searching, measuring, finding nothing soft but something steady, something that did not waver. And she realized in that moment that whatever this man was, he was not like the others. He did not hide behind ritual or excuse. He acted, and that truth unsettled her more than the threat of the cliff ever had, because a man who acted could change everything, and everything could demand a price. And yet the storm pressed closer, the road behind them growing darker, the town no longer a place she could return to. And so, with a breath that trembled only once, she nodded, barely, and he reached for her again, this time guiding her toward the horse with careful precision, lifting her as though she weighed nothing, setting her before him without hesitation, the motion practiced yet restrained, his arms steady at her side, never tightening more than necessary. And as the horse began to move, the rhythm of hooves against stone carrying them away from the only life she had known, Evelyn looked back once, just once, at the distant glow of lanterns shrinking into the night, and she felt something inside her loosen, not grief, not regret, but the quiet severing of a past that had tried to erase her, while ahead, the road curved into darkness, toward a silhouette that slowly emerged through the storm, a vast estate of stone and shadow rising against the sky, like something both shelter and warning. And Adrian's voice came again, softer now, but no less certain. "You are safe for now." And the words should have brought comfort, but instead they settled in her chest with a different weight, because she understood what he had not said, that safety was never permanent, not for someone like her, not with what she carried hidden against her skin. And as her fingers brushed the edge of the locket, a faint, almost imperceptible sound came from within, a tiny shift, a reminder of the truth sealed inside. And for the first time since he had saved her, a thought formed clear and sharp in her mind, that perhaps he had not rescued her from fate at all, but had stepped directly into it. The estate revealed itself slowly through the storm, not as a place of warmth, but as something ancient and watchful, its tall stone walls rising from the earth as though they had always been there, its windows dim with scattered candlelight that flickered against the rain like distant stars refusing to fully shine. And Evelyn felt the horse slow beneath them as they approached the iron gates, the sound of hooves shifting from hard road to gravel echoing into the vast silence surrounding the manor, a silence so complete it seemed untouched by the world she had just left behind. And when the gates opened without a word, drawn by unseen hands, she understood that this place did not ask questions before admitting its guests. It simply accepted them and let the truth unfold later, and Adrian did not speak as they crossed the threshold, his posture unchanged, his focus forward, as though he had already moved beyond the night behind them. While Evelyn could not, her thoughts still caught between the cliff and the road, between death and whatever this was. And as they reached the wide stone steps leading to the entrance, the doors opened before they even stopped, revealing a hall lined with towering pillars and shadows that stretched long beneath the dim glow of chandeliers. The air inside, warmer but no less heavy, carrying the faint scent of wood, old books, and something else she could not name, something that lingered like memory. And servants appeared quietly at the edges of the space, their movements careful, their expressions controlled, yet their eyes betrayed curiosity, not at the Duke, but at her, the girl who had arrived from the storm without introduction, without place, without explanation. And for the first time since leaving the cliff, Evelyn became aware of how she must look, her dress damp, her hair undone, her presence an interruption in a world built on order. An instinct urged her to shrink, to disappear into the walls as she had done all her life. But something in the way Adrian stepped forward prevented it, because he did not present her as something to be hidden, nor as something to be explained. He simply walked as though her presence required no justification. And when he stopped at the center of the hall, his voice carried through the space with quiet authority. "Prepare a room," he said, not specifying, not elaborating, and no one questioned it. No one dared, because whatever had entered with him was now part of his domain. And as the servants moved to obey, Evelyn remained still for a moment longer, her gaze lifting slowly to take in the vastness around her, the carved railings, the sweeping staircase, the distant corridors that disappeared into darkness. And she felt it then, not safety, not yet, but distance, distance from the place that had nearly claimed her, distance from the voices that had tried to silence her. And yet the weight in her hand remained, the small locket pressing into her palm, as if reminding her that she had not left everything behind, that some things followed, no matter how far she traveled. And when Adrian turned slightly toward her, his expression unchanged but his attention unmistakable, she realized that this place, this man, this moment, had not ended anything at all. It had only begun something she could not yet understand. And as a servant approached to guide her up the staircase, Evelyn took her first step into the manor, unaware that every shadow she passed held a piece of a story waiting to recognize her. The staircase seemed to rise endlessly beneath Evelyn's feet, each step cushioned by thick carpet that muted even the sound of her breathing, as if the house itself preferred silence, preferred secrets carried quietly rather than spoken aloud. And the servant who guided her did not speak either, her hands folded neatly, her gaze lowered, moving with the practiced ease of someone who understood her place within these walls. And Evelyn followed without question, though her eyes moved constantly, tracing every detail, every shadow, every flicker of candlelight along the carved banister. Because this place was unlike anything she had ever known, not simply in its size or its elegance, but in the way it held itself, as though it were aware of its own history and chose carefully what it revealed. And when they reached the upper corridor, the air shifted slightly, warmer, quieter, the storm outside reduced to a distant murmur behind thick stone, and for a moment, Evelyn felt something unfamiliar press against her chest. Not fear, not quite relief, but a fragile pause between what had been and what might come next. And the servant stopped before a tall wooden door, opening it with a soft motion that revealed a room lit by a low fire, its glow steady and inviting, the bed prepared, linen smooth, a basin of warm water waiting as if someone had anticipated her arrival long before she had ever set foot here. And Evelyn hesitated at the threshold, her hand tightening around the locket hidden in her palm, because nothing in her life had ever been prepared for her, nothing had ever waited. And yet here it was, a space carved out for her existence without explanation. And when she finally stepped inside, The servant inclined her head slightly before retreating, closing the door with a quiet finality that left Evelyn alone with the stillness. And the silence wrapped around her like something almost tangible, pressing in gently, asking nothing, demanding nothing. And for the first time since the night began, her shoulders lowered just slightly, her breath deepening as she moved further into the room, her fingers brushing the edge of the fireplace mantel, feeling the warmth seep into her skin, grounding her in a way the cold wind never had. And yet, even in that warmth, her awareness remained sharp, her instincts unwilling to rest, because she knew too well that comfort could be as dangerous as fear, that places like this did not exist. Without purpose, and as she crossed to the small mirror resting against the wall, her reflection met her in the dim light, pale, tired, her hair loose and damp, her expression carrying something new beneath the exhaustion, something steadier, something that had survived the edge of a cliff and the weight of unseen truths. And slowly, carefully, she opened her hand, revealing the locket at last, its surface worn but unmistakably intricate, a design too deliberate to be meaningless. And as she turned it between her fingers, the faint click from earlier echoed again, softer now, as if whatever it held was waiting, not for time, but for the right moment. And Evelyn closed her hand around it once more, her gaze lifting toward the door as a thought settled quietly in her mind, that the man who had brought her here had not asked who she was, had not demanded explanation, and that silence, more than anything else, felt like a question that had yet to be answered. Sleep did not come easily, not in a place where silence felt too perfect, too deliberate, and Evelyn lay awake for what felt like hours, the fire casting shifting patterns across the ceiling while the storm outside softened into a distant whisper, her body exhausted, yet her mind unwilling to surrender, replaying every moment from the cliff to the hall, from the silk bindings to the steady grip that had pulled her back, and each memory carried a question she could not answer, because nothing about this night had followed the rules she had always known. And when at last her eyes closed, it was not peace that took her, but something deeper, heavier, a kind of drifting that carried her somewhere between memory and truth, where voices echoed faintly and the air felt colder than it should. And she saw again the edge of the cliff, but this time she was not alone, a figure standing just beyond her reach, indistinct yet familiar, watching her with a stillness that felt like recognition. And before she could speak, before she could move closer, the sound of a door opening pulled her sharply back into waking, her breath catching as her eyes opened to the dim glow of the fire, the room unchanged yet somehow different, as if something unseen had shifted while she slept. And for a moment she did not move, listening, her senses sharpening, until she realized the sound had not come from her door, but from somewhere beyond it, deeper within the corridor, a quiet disturbance in a house that had seemed so carefully controlled. An instinct stirred again, that same instinct that had kept her alive when others had turned away, and she sat up slowly, her bare feet touching the soft rug as she crossed the room without lighting a candle, guided only by the faint glow beneath the door. And when she opened it just enough to look beyond, the corridor stretched empty and still, yet not untouched, because further down, a single door stood slightly ajar, light spilling faintly into the darkness, and something about it drew her forward, not curiosity alone, but recognition, as if the house itself had whispered a direction only she could hear. And each step she took was careful, silent, her breath measured as she approached the open doorway, her fingers brushing the cool wall for balance, until she reached the threshold and paused, her gaze slipping inside. And what she saw was not what she expected, not a grand chamber or a gathering, but a room lined with shelves and papers, a study perhaps, its fire low, its atmosphere heavy with thought rather than comfort. And there, standing before a desk scattered with documents, was Adrian Blackthorne, his posture unchanged from before, composed, controlled, yet something in the way his shoulders held stillness spoke of a different weight, a private one. And he did not turn immediately, as if he had known she would come, as if her presence had been anticipated long before she stepped into the hall. And when he finally spoke, his voice quiet but certain, it did not carry surprise. "You should not be awake." And yet there was no command in it, only observation, and Evelyn did not step back, did not retreat, because something within her had shifted as well, something that refused to remain silent any longer, and though her voice was soft, it carried its own kind of steadiness when she answered, "Neither should you." And in that moment, beneath the dim light and the quiet storm beyond the walls, something unspoken passed between them, not trust, not yet, but the recognition that neither of them had truly escaped the night that had brought them here. Adrian did not turn fully at once, as if giving her the chance to retreat, to pretend she had not crossed into a space that was clearly not meant for rest but for truths that refused to sleep. And Evelyn remained where she stood, her hand still resting lightly against the doorframe, her breath steady despite the quiet tension that filled the room, because something in his presence demanded honesty without asking for it. And when he finally faced her, the firelight revealed more than it concealed. The sharp lines of his expression softened just enough to show the weight behind his composure. Not weakness, never that, but the kind of burden that came from knowing too much and trusting too little. And his eyes moved to her hands, to the way her fingers curled slightly as though guarding something unseen, before returning to her face with quiet precision. "Most people would be asleep after a night like yours," he said, his voice even, measured, yet carrying a subtle undercurrent of observation that made it clear he was not simply speaking, he was studying. And Evelyn took a small step into the room, not fully entering, not yet claiming the space, but refusing to remain at its edge, her gaze shifting briefly to the desk where papers lay scattered in careful disorder, maps and names, fragments of something larger that did not belong to coincidence. And when she spoke, her voice was soft but unwavering. "Most people would not have brought me here," and the words settled between them with a quiet weight, not accusation, not gratitude, but truth. And for a moment neither of them moved, the silence stretching not with discomfort but with recognition, because each understood that the other had stepped beyond what was expected of them, and that nothing about this situation could return to simplicity. And Adrian's gaze flickered once more to her hand, to the subtle tension in her fingers, before he spoke again, more directly this time. What were they trying to silence? And it was not a question formed from curiosity, it was a conclusion spoken aloud, and Evelyn felt it then, the shift from being saved to being seen. And that was far more dangerous, because being seen meant being known, and being known meant the truth could no longer remain hidden. And for a brief moment she considered deflecting, stepping back into the role she had played all her life, quiet, unnoticed, safe in her invisibility. But something in the way he stood, unyielding yet not unkind, made that impossible. And slowly, carefully, she opened her hand, the locket catching the firelight as it rested against her palm, its surface worn but unmistakably deliberate. And Adrian's expression did not change, yet something in his eyes sharpened, recognition flickering beneath restraint, as if he had seen something like it before, or had been waiting to. And Evelyn held his gaze as she spoke, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to reveal. "They were not offering me to save anything," she said, each word deliberate. "They were offering me so this would never be found." And the faint click sounded again as the locket shifted slightly in her hand, small, almost imperceptible, yet loud enough in the silence to feel like a door waiting to be opened. And Adrian stepped closer then, not reaching for it, not taking it from her, but closing the distance just enough to make it clear that whatever lay within that small piece of metal had already changed the course of everything. And in that moment, the storm outside no longer felt like the greatest force at work, because something far quieter, far more deliberate, had begun to unfold inside the walls of Blackthorn Hall. The small sound of the locket settling into place seemed louder than the storm beyond the walls. And for a moment neither of them spoke, as if both understood that whatever lay inside that delicate hinge was not meant to be opened lightly. And Evelyn felt the weight of it more acutely now, not just in her hand, but in the way Adrian's gaze remained fixed, steady, unflinching, not demanding yet impossible to ignore. And she drew a slow breath, her fingers tightening briefly before relaxing again, because if this moment was going to come, it would not be forced, it would be chosen. And that choice, fragile as it was, felt like the only thing that still belonged to her. And Adrian seemed to recognize it, because he did not move closer, did not reach out. He simply waited, his presence filling the space without pressing against it. and that restraint, more than anything, made the silence between them feel deliberate rather than uncertain. And finally, with a motion that was both careful and inevitable, Evelyn pressed her thumb against the edge of the locket and opened it, the hinge releasing with a soft, final click, revealing not a jewel, not something ornamental, but a folded fragment of paper, aged and worn yet preserved with precision. Its edges softened by time, but its presence unmistakably important. And as the firelight caught the faint ink beneath its surface, Adrian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, recognition deepening into something more focused, something that carried the weight of memory, and he stepped closer, just enough to see without intruding, his voice lower now, quieter, yet carrying a different kind of intensity. "Where did you get this?" And it was not suspicion that colored his words, but certainty, as though the answer already existed somewhere within him, waiting to be confirmed. And Evelyn did not lower the locket, did not hide it again, because she understood now that hiding it had been what nearly ended her, and her voice, though soft, held steady as she answered. "It was given to me before anyone knew what it meant." And her eyes met his, searching for something she could not yet name, because whatever he saw in that small piece of paper, whatever it stirred in him, was not simple curiosity. It was something far more personal. Something tied not just to her past but to his, and the air in the room seemed to shift again, heavier, charged with a quiet tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with truth waiting to surface. And Adrian's gaze moved from the locket back to her face, studying her with a new precision, as if recalculating everything he had assumed since the moment he found her on the cliff. And when he spoke again, the words came slower, more deliberate. "That was not meant to survive." And Evelyn felt the meaning behind it settle into her chest, because if something was not meant to survive, then everything built around its absence was a lie. And she closed the locket gently, not out of reluctance, but out of understanding that its contents had already been seen, already begun their work. And as her hand lowered, the space between them no longer felt uncertain, it felt aligned. Two separate paths now crossing into something neither of them had planned. And beyond the walls, the storm continued to fade, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt empty, because within it, something far more enduring had begun to take shape. The words lingered between them long after they were spoken, not as a conclusion, but as the beginning of something neither of them could yet fully grasp. And Evelyn felt the quiet shift settle deeper within her. Because what she carried was no longer just a secret meant to survive. It had become a truth that demanded to be understood. And Adrian turned slightly away from her then, not in dismissal, but in thought, his gaze moving back to the scattered documents across his desk, as though the pieces before him had suddenly rearranged themselves into something far more coherent, something that now included her. And when he reached for one of the papers, his movements remained controlled, deliberate, yet there was a new tension beneath them, a focus sharpened by recognition rather than curiosity. And he laid the document flat, the edges catching the firelight as he spoke, his voice quieter, more inward. "This estate was not always mine by simple inheritance." And the statement carried weight without explanation, an opening rather than a declaration. And Evelyn stepped further into the room, drawn not by the paper itself, but by the gravity in his tone, because whatever he was revealing was not offered lightly. And he continued without looking at her, as if the act of speaking required distance. There were claims, disputes, records that disappeared before they could be challenged. And his fingers hovered just above the inked lines as though tracing something unseen, something remembered rather than written. And Evelyn felt the connection form before it was spoken, the fragile thread between the hidden note in her locket and the gaps in his history. And her voice, though soft, carried certainty when she answered. And this would have proven something different. And Adrian's hand stilled completely at that, the silence stretching not with hesitation but with confirmation, because she had understood without needing the full story. And when he finally looked at her again, there was no distance left in his gaze, only clarity, the kind that came when uncertainty had been stripped away. "It would have changed everything," he said, and the words settled into the room with a finality that could not be undone. And for a moment neither of them moved, the fire crackling softly between them as the storm outside faded further into silence. leaving behind a stillness that felt heavier than before, because now it was filled with meaning, and Evelyn closed her hand around the locket once more, not to hide it, but to hold it steady, because it no longer felt like something she had to protect alone. And yet that realization brought its own unease, because if the truth connected her to this place, to this man, then it also tied her to whatever had been buried to keep it hidden, and Adrian seemed to sense it as well, because when he spoke again, his tone shifted slightly, not colder, not softer, but more resolved. Whoever wanted that gone will not stop. And it was not a warning meant to frighten her, but a fact laid plainly between them, and Evelyn did not look away, did not retreat from it, because fear had already taken everything it could from her, and what remained was something steadier, something that had been forged in silence and survival, and she answered simply, "They already tried." And the quiet strength in her voice carried more weight than any declaration, and Adrian inclined his head just slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if recognizing something in her that matched his own understanding of what lay ahead. And as the fire burned lower and the shadows deepened along the walls, the space between them no longer felt like a distance to be crossed, but a line already drawn, one that bound them not by choice alone, but by a truth that neither of them could ignore. And in that moment, within the quiet walls of the study, it became clear that the night had not ended when the storm began to fade. It had only just begun to reveal what it had been hiding all along. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt decided, as though something unseen had settled into place the moment their understanding aligned. And Adrian moved first, not away from her, but with purpose, gathering a small stack of documents from the desk and setting them aside with a quiet finality, as if the questions they once held had already been answered in ways he had not expected. And Evelyn watched him closely, her gaze no longer uncertain but attentive, because she understood now that this was not a man who lingered in hesitation. He acted when truth demanded it. And when he turned back toward her, there was a clarity in his expression that had not been there before, something resolved beneath the restraint. "You will not return there," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight that left no space for argument, not because he commanded it, but because he had already decided it. And Evelyn felt the echo of that decision settle within her, not as control, but as protection, shaped by certainty. And for a brief moment she allowed herself to consider what that meant, to exist in a place where her survival was not something she had to fight for alone. And yet, even as that thought formed, another followed, quieter but just as persistent, because nothingness certain ever came without consequence. And she stepped closer, not retreating from the truth that had begun to unfold, her voice steady as she asked, "And when they come here?" And the question did not need to be finished, because both of them already knew it would happen, that whatever had been hidden would not remain buried simply because it had been found. And Adrian's gaze held hers without wavering, the answer already present before he spoke it. "They will not take you." And there was no force in the statement, no raised voice, only the quiet, immovable assurance of a man who had already measured the cost and accepted it. And something in Evelyn stilled at that, not out of submission, but recognition, because she understood what it meant to stand against something that could not be reasoned with. And for the first time since the night had begun, she did not feel like the one being hunted. And the shift was subtle but undeniable, like stepping out of a shadow and realizing that darkness had not followed. And Adrian's attention moved briefly to the locket still held in her hand, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly, not with doubt, but with calculation. And he spoke again, more measured now. "That stays with you." And the instruction was not about possession, it was about purpose, as though he understood that whatever truth it contained was not meant to be taken, not yet. And Evelyn closed her fingers around it once more, feeling its weight settle more firmly against her palm, no longer just a relic of the past, but something active, something that would shape what came next. And as the fire burned lower and the room grew dimmer, the edges of the world seemed to narrow around them, focusing not on what had already happened, but on what would follow. And when Adrian finally stepped back, creating a small distance between them once more, it did not feel like separation. It felt like preparation, as though the line between them had shifted from uncertainty to alliance. And Evelyn understood then that whatever this night had taken from her, it had also given her something she had never expected, not safety, not yet, but a place within a story that had not finished writing itself. And as she turned toward the door, the quiet echo of her steps returning down the corridor, the house no longer felt like something she had entered by chance. It felt like something she had been brought to for a reason she was only beginning to understand, and somewhere deep within its walls, that reason was already waiting. The corridor felt different as Evelyn returned to her room, not quieter, not darker, but more aware, as if the house itself had taken notice of her presence and was now watching in its own silent way. And her steps slowed slightly, not out of hesitation but out of thought, because every word spoken in the study still echoed in her mind, reshaping the meaning of everything she had carried until now. And when she reached her door and closed it behind her, the soft click did not bring the same isolation it had before. It felt like a boundary, one that separated what she had been from what she was becoming. And she stood there for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the wood, her breath steady but deeper than before, as if the weight she carried had shifted rather than lessened. And when she finally turned back into the room, the fire had burned lower, its glow softer, casting longer shadows that stretched across the walls and floor, and she moved toward it without thinking, drawn by its warmth. Yet her attention was no longer on comfort, it was on understanding, and she crossed to the small table near the window, her fingers slowly opening around the locket once more, this time with no hesitation, because what it held had already changed everything. And as she placed it gently on the surface before her, she studied it in the dim light, tracing the worn edges, the deliberate craftsmanship, the way it had been made not for beauty but for preservation. And a memory stirred faintly at the edge of her thoughts, not clear, not complete, but enough to remind her that this had not simply appeared in her life. It had been given and trusted, and that trust carried its own kind of responsibility, and she drew a slow breath before opening it again, more carefully this time, her fingers steady as the hinge gave way, revealing the folded fragment inside. And she did not rush to unfold it, did not disturb it more than necessary, because she understood now that its value was not in being read again, but in what it had already proven. And yet as her gaze lingered, something caught her attention, something she had not noticed before, a faint marking along the inner edge of the locket itself, nearly invisible unless the light struck it just right. And she leaned closer, her brow tightening slightly as she adjusted the angle, and there it was, a small engraving, subtle but unmistakable, a crest she had seen only once before, fleetingly, in a place she had not fully understood at the time. And the realization came slowly, like a piece sliding into place within a larger design, because that same symbol had been etched into one of the documents on Adrian's desk, partially obscured beneath layers of ink and time. And Evelyn felt the connection settle into her with quiet certainty, not as a revelation, but as confirmation of something that had already begun to form. And her hand closed gently around the locket again, not to hide it, but to hold on to the clarity it now represented. And she moved to the window, her gaze lifting to the dark grounds beyond, where the storm had fully passed, leaving the world outside still and untouched, as if nothing had happened at all. And yet she knew better now, because what had begun tonight was not bound to the storm. It was something far more enduring, something that had waited long before she had ever stepped onto that cliff. And as her reflection faintly met her in the glass, she saw not the girl who had stood at the edge, but someone standing at the beginning of something she could no longer walk away from. And in the quiet of that realization, one thought settled firmly into place, that whatever had been hidden within this house, within that locket, and within the silence of those who had tried to erase it, was no longer buried, and it would not remain unanswered. Morning did not arrive with brightness. It came quietly, like a breath drawn after a long-held silence, and Evelyn woke not to noise but to stillness, the kind that felt deliberate, as though the house had settled into a new rhythm overnight, one that now included her. And for a moment she remained where she was, her gaze tracing the soft light filtering through the tall window, the shadows no longer shifting but resting, as if even the walls had accepted what had begun. And her hand moved instinctively to the locket resting near her bedside, her fingers brushing its surface with familiarity that had deepened into something steadier, something grounded in understanding rather than fear. And as she sat up slowly, the events of the night returned not as fragments, but as a continuous thread, each moment leading to the next with a clarity she had not possessed before. And she rose, crossing the room with measured steps, her reflection catching briefly in the mirror, no longer uncertain, no longer searching for escape, but focused, aware. And when she reached the door and opened it, the corridor beyond was already awake, though not with chaos, but with quiet movement, servants passing with soft footsteps, their presence controlled, their attention no longer lingering on her with curiosity, but with something closer to acknowledgement, as though her place within these walls had been silently established. And as she moved forward, guided not by instruction but by instinct, the house seemed to open around her, each turn familiar despite its size, each shadow less imposing than before, and she found herself drawn once more toward the study, not out of uncertainty, but purpose, because what had begun there had not yet been finished. And when she reached the door, it stood slightly ajar, the same quiet invitation as the night before, and she entered without hesitation, her gaze lifting immediately to where Adrian stood by the window, the morning light outlining his figure in a way the firelight had not, revealing not softness but clarity, the kind that came with daylight. And he did not turn at once, as though giving her the space to speak first, to decide whether this moment would continue or remain suspended. And Evelyn stepped forward, her voice calm, certain, carrying none of the hesitation it once held. "The crest inside the locket," she said, and the words were enough, because Adrian turned then, his attention immediate, precise, and something in his expression shifted, not in surprise, but in confirmation, as if the final piece had been placed. And she continued, her gaze steady. "It matches what is hidden in your records." And the connection, once unspoken, now stood between them without disguise. And Adrian took a step closer, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to acknowledge what had changed. "Then it was never meant to leave this house," he said, and the weight of that realization settled fully into the space. Because if it had not been meant to leave, then everything that had happened since had been shaped by something far older than either of them. And Evelyn felt it then, not as fear, but as inevitability, because whatever path had brought her here had not been random. It had been directed, guided by a truth that refused to remain hidden. And as she looked at him, she understood that neither of them stood outside of it any longer. And the silence that followed did not ask what came next. It already knew. And in that quiet certainty, something unspoken passed between them once more. Not doubt, not hesitation, but the recognition that the story unfolding within these walls had only just begun to reveal its true shape. The realization did not arrive like a sudden revelation. It settled slowly, like light spreading across a landscape that had always been there, waiting to be seen. And Evelyn stood within that quiet understanding, her hand resting lightly against the locket at her side, no longer hidden, no longer guarded in fear, but held with purpose, because what it carried had already changed the course of her life, and now stood at the center of something far greater than either of them alone. And Adrian remained where he was, his gaze steady, his posture composed. Yet there was no distance left between what he knew and what he chose. Because whatever truth had been buried within this house, within his name, had now found its way back through her, and neither of them could turn away from it. And the morning light continued to rise behind him, illuminating the edges of the room, revealing details that had been softened by shadow the night before, the lines of the shelves, the aged documents, the quiet history embedded in every surface. And Evelyn understood then that this place had never been silent. It had simply been waiting for the right voice to break that silence. And without hesitation she stepped closer, not as someone seeking permission, but as someone claiming her place within the truth that had chosen her. And her voice, when she spoke, carried no uncertainty, only clarity. "Then it belongs to both of us now." And the words settled between them not as a challenge, but as an acknowledgement of what had already begun. And Adrian did not respond immediately, not because he questioned it, but because he understood the weight of what she had said. And when he finally inclined his head, the gesture was small, controlled, yet it carried something unmistakable, acceptance, not of her presence alone, but of the path that now lay ahead of them both. And the silence that followed was no longer filled with tension. It held alignment, two separate histories converging into a single direction that neither could fully see, yet neither would deny. And beyond the tall windows, the sky had cleared completely. The storm reduced to nothing more than memory, yet its echo remained within the walls, within the choices made beneath its cover. And Evelyn turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the distant grounds, where the world stretched outward in quiet stillness, unchanged to anyone who did not know what had shifted beneath its surface. And for a moment she allowed herself to feel it, the distance from the girl who had stood at the edge of the cliff, the one who had been chosen to disappear, and the woman who now stood within a house that held answers meant to be erased. And the contrast did not frighten her, it steadied her, because she understood now that survival had never been the end of her story, it had only been the beginning. And when she looked back at Adrian, there was no hesitation left in her gaze, no uncertainty in her presence, only a quiet, unspoken agreement that whatever came next would not be faced alone. And as the light filled the room completely, dissolving the last traces of shadow, one truth remained clear above all others, that some fates are not rewritten by chance, but by the moment two lives cross at the exact point where truth can no longer remain hidden. And in that moment, everything changes.